immigrant detention centers, which I believe most of you know, deserve that and then some. And she's in particular played a pivotal role in documenting and publishing the abuses at both Stewart and Irwin detention facilities here in Georgia, including on several occasions and several reports, but most recently with the, with the whistleblower investigation on the just atrocious medical practices at Irwin against the women there, which I'm sure she'll share some more with us tonight on. And I just want to say that the work of eliminating detention and being in solidarity with immigrants who are detained is very much one of the flanks of the work of the Immigrant Action team here. So we're very excited to have Azadeh here. And just so you know, my admiration for her is shared by many. She's won many awards, the U.S. Human Rights Network and Human Rights Movement Builder Award, the American Immigration Lawyer Association Advocacy Award, Emory Law School's Outstanding Leadership and Public Interest Award, and among many others, was recognized as one of Atlanta's 500 most powerful leaders by Atlanta Magazine. And you may also know Azadeh from her writings and publications and panelist talks with The Guardian, The Nation, MSNBC, USA Today, Al Jazeera, HuffPost, and many others. So really welcome and good evening, and hand it over to you, Azadeh.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Ellen for the invite and for your very kind words and support always, and the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Atlanta for hosting me. So as Ellen mentioned, I serve as Legal and Advocacy Director at Project South and also as co-counsel on the class action lawsuit that was filed on behalf of survivors of medical abuse at the Irving County Detention Center, which, as I'm sure you all have heard, was a site of systematic medical abuse against immigrant women, including forced sterilizations. But first, I would like to extend my solidarity to Asian American communities in light of the horrific attacks in Atlanta last week and increasing hate attacks targeting Asian Americans. We stand with Asian American communities and determined as ever to work together to dismantle white supremacy. So Project South is a social justice organization based in Atlanta, working in support of grassroots organizations and Black, Brown, immigrant, and undocumented and Muslim communities in the US South, as well as in solidarity and joint struggle with Black and Indigenous communities in the Global South. We work on various areas such as immigration detention, ending local police collusion with ICE, defending and protecting Muslim communities against state surveillance and repression, and ensuring that undocumented people have access to fundamental rights, such as the right to access utilities and higher education. We are part of a movement that believes systemic state violence is not to be tolerated in any form, whether it is ICE caging and harming immigrants or cops murdering Black people in the street with impunity. So obviously, I'm going to talk about immigration detention and really the need to abolish immigration detention and shut down the detention centers in Georgia. But I'm happy during the discussion period to talk about any of our work that I just mentioned. So to begin with Irving, we have documented conditions at the Irving County Detention Center for many years. And we know that the treatment of immigrants at this prison has always been horrid. In our 2017 report, In Prison Justice, Inside Two Georgia Immigrant Detention Centers, Project South and the Penn State Law Center for Immigrants' Rights Clinic found evidence of sexual abuse, inadequate medical care, lack of prenatal care for pregnant women, lack of clean drinking water, and rampant use of solitary confinement at the prison. Those who have spoken out about the abuses over the years have consistently faced retaliation. So for example, last year around this time, a group of women came together and produced a video expressing their fears about catching COVID at Irving and the fact that this prison was not doing anything to protect them. Now, instead of addressing their fears and doing something to protect them, the guards placed them in solitary confinement, which obviously subjected the women to really grave emotional harm. In September, Project South, along with our partners, Georgia Latin Alliance for Human Rights, Georgia Detention Watch, and South Georgia Immigrant Support Network, submitted a complaint to the Department of Homeland Security, OIG. And part of the complaint had to do with COVID, lack of protection against COVID. Some of the issues that we talked about in the complaint. So medical staff deliberately not testing detained immigrants for COVID-19, even when they were symptomatic, had pre-existing conditions, and or had requested to be tested multiple times spanning a month. Medical staff shredding medical requests from detained immigrants and fabricating medical records for them, falsely indicating that they have been seen. Management mandating employees to work, even if they were symptomatic and waiting for test results. The management deliberately lying to both detained immigrants and employees about how many COVID cases there are in the prison, and other issues. And so the shocking revelations about medical abuse against women's bodies further highlight the extent of the egregious abuses at this prison, and the fact that Black and Brown immigrant women have been held in an extremely vulnerable position at this prison, where they have no control over their bodies and no say about what is done to them, is sickening. So we are glad that our complaint opened the door to more women coming forward with accounts of what was done to them. In the class action lawsuit that was filed in late December, in total, more than 40 women filed sworn testimony in court as part of the lawsuit, despite consistent attempts by ICE to silence them. And among them are 35 survivors of medical abuse. But it pains me to know that there could be many more women out there in some part of the world who will never be able to talk about what happened to them and the abuse that they suffered while at Irving, let alone receive a measure of redress, while living with the lifelong damage to their bodies and spirits. Not surprisingly, ICE has not been forthcoming with information. Rather, they've been actively trying to cover their own tracks through deporting survivors and witnesses to medical abuse. And if it was not because of the documentation work happening and advocates' efforts to track down and reach out to women all over the world and courage of the impacted women, none of this would have ever come to light. So ICE already deported 6 survivors and was trying to deport several more before lawyers and members of Congress stepped in to try to stop the deportations. ICE has also used other tactics of retaliations against those who speak out, such as threats of placing women in solitary or actually subjecting them to solitary confinement. The court filing also includes evidence showing that ICE and private contractors at the prison knew as far back as 2018 about the abuse being inflicted on women, and yet they did nothing. Instead, they kept sending women to the same doctor. So given what we have learned about the systematic violence against immigrants' bodies at Irving, we need ICE to come clean about what is happening at ICE prisons nationwide. Immigrants cannot have their bodily integrity at the mercy of ICE and the private prison corporations that the agency contracts with. And that is why we have filed a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain information about gynecological procedures at ICE prisons nationwide. We filed that in the fall, early in the fall. Not surprisingly, ICE did not provide us with any information, so we had to file a lawsuit. And so we're currently in the process of negotiation with the government in terms of releasing the records. And an update is that pursuant to the class action lawsuit brought on behalf of the survivors of medical abuse at Irving, all known survivors of medical abuse have now been released. But first of all, for one thing, Irving is still open, right? I mean, a lot of us expected that or hoped that one of the first things that the Biden administration would do would be to shut this prison down, and yet it is still open. And another really horrible development is that women are now transferred to Stewart, which is a deadly corporate-run prison with a forced labor program and a documented record of other egregious human rights violations. This is an extremely troubling development and a clear attempt by ICE to deflect attention from abuses at Irving. There have been at least 8 deaths at Stewart since May 2017, 2 by suicide, 4 during the pandemic, which makes Stewart the deadliest facility in the country during the pandemic. So, the deaths at Stewart, 57-year-old Felix Montes de Oca Marcelino died in January. This was the first death in immigration detention under the Biden administration, anywhere in the country. Cipriano Chavez Alvarez, 61, died from COVID-19 in September 2020 after being detained at Stewart. We also had the preventable death of Jose Freddy Guillen Vega, a 7-year-old who died of COVID-19 complications in August 2020. In May 2020, Santiago Button Oxlage, who's 34, of Guatemala, died from COVID-19. So here you have ICE detaining the elderly and people with pre-existing conditions at Irving during this deadly pandemic, which tells you how much they don't care about the well-being of people in their custody. So in terms of what we need for accountability, the scrutiny must not stop with examining the actions of one individual, namely the doctor. This is about ICE and the private prison corporation La Salle, and the broader system that allowed this to happen and continue to happen. So both Irving and Stewart must be shut down immediately and people should be freed. And the egregious retaliation against those who speak out must end. The women who suffered medical abuse must receive redress for the harm that they suffered. And the US government, as well as the private prison corporation running these prisons, must be held accountable. We are determined to push ahead by pursuing a thorough congressional investigation, DHS OIG investigation, and we have also gone to the UN and their Inter-American Commission to expose the human rights violations. And of course, in terms of the bigger picture, we need to shut all of these prisons down. As a first step, the Biden administration could mandate and should mandate that ICE stop dealing with private prison corporations. This is really the same mandate that they issued to the Department of Justice. So we cannot entrust the care of human beings to private prison corporations, as we know that their main interest is maximizing profit. Just case in point, I mentioned that there's a forced labor program at the Stewart Detention Center. We are actually currently co-counsel in a class action lawsuit challenging that forced labor program. The way it operates is that the prison corporation, Core Civic, which used to be known as Corrections Corporation of America, and they changed their name to escape their horrible reputation, they pay people, the detained immigrants, between $1 to $4 a day to do the work that they would have had to hire regularly waged employees to do. And this is very interesting because they go to these very poor counties, both Stewart and Irving being, some of the poorest in the state, with the promise of jobs for the local community. And instead what they do is to hire, to rely on the forced labor of detained immigrants to maximize their profits, obviously. And so, one of our clients, Shoaib Ahmed, who has since been deported, he was working for several days, did not get paid. And then he said, no work tomorrow. And for that act of, standing up to this private prison corporation, he was placed in solitary confinement for several days. And he still is dealing with the pain, both physical and emotional, that he suffered while he was at Stewart all those years ago. So actions that people can take to support: contact your member of Congress, please. We need an investigation of ICE and prison corporations. Just because we have a Democratic administration in office right now does not mean that, anything has changed really. The reality of the situation is that these ICE prisons are still open. And it's the same as it was before. And so, members of Congress, some members of Congress who used to speak out during the Trump administration, I think, because of partisan politics, I haven't really heard them say much. I didn't hear a single member of Congress say anything about the death that, we had at Stewart in January, the first death under the Biden administration. As I mentioned, the 57-year-old Felix Montes de Oca Marcelino. Why? Why should they not speak out about this death? It's a human being who has died, and there's no need for them to stay silent. And so, we as constituents really need to speak up and hold them accountable and make it clear to them that, again, even though a different administration is in office, we're not going to stop speaking up because there are human beings dying at these prisons and they need to be shut down. Again, keep up the pressure and please also follow the lead of the grassroots organizations, including the groups that filed the complaint in September. We really need and appreciate your support. And get involved in local grassroots campaigns for abolition. We do not need a reform, right? We're not trying to make these jails prettier. We need to shut them down. And see what type of support they need. An organization like the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights that does really, really great work. And they definitely could use your support. So I would like to leave you with this quote from the freedom fighter Fannie Lou Hamer: "Nobody's free until everybody's free." And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Azadeh. They're very powerful and interesting. So we open now for a Q&A, and you are welcome, as I believe you heard Carrie say before, either to just raise your hand using the little reaction button there, or waving your hand too if you're on screen, to speak, and we'll give you opportunity, or otherwise, please feel free to put it in the chat and we'll be sure to get those over. So the floor is open for questions.
Looks like we have a question from Blake McNulty. Give me just 1 second and I will get you spotlighted.
Yeah, I unmuted. Good. At what level was the decision made to privatize these facilities? And secondly, where is policy made? Is it within the privatized organization, or does it go up to Congress? What role does Congress play in all of this? Or does it go all the way to the presidency?
Well, so ICE is part of the Department of Homeland Security, which is part of the Biden administration, right? So at the end of the day, the buck stops with Biden, is where that is. But Congress also has a lot of power because Congress gives ICE the funding. So Congress at any point can decide to defund ICE. And so, all of those the nice rhetoric that we heard in the fall in terms of, members of Congress coming down. I think about 12 members came down, visited Irvin, met with the women, got out, called for Irvin to be shut down, called it a horror show. That was all nice. But then when they decide to continue to provide funding for ICE, that shows you that that was empty rhetoric, right? So, on the congressional front, we need them to defund ICE. We need a congressional investigation, which we still haven't seen. We haven't seen a thorough congressional investigation of the abuses that happened at Irvin and the other detention centers. And on the administration front, we need to hold ICE accountable. I mean, a lot of our organizations are calling for ICE to be abolished. I would venture to say, we need the entirety of the Department of Homeland Security to be abolished. Remember that it was formed after 9/11, in the post 9/11 atmosphere of extreme xenophobia, Islamophobia. And so, you have this department, its entire framing is looking at immigrants as a problem for national security, as threats to national security, rather than as fellow human beings, many of whom are seeking refuge in this country. And so, pressure also needs to be on the Biden administration to abolish ICE for sure. And then, in the immediate future, as I mentioned, they need to stop dealing with private prison corporations. And so ICE is basically the agency that is making that decision in terms of, which private prison corporations to deal with. And so currently we're in a place where more than 80% of detained immigrants are in prisons operated by private prison corporations. And let's remember the power of the lobby power of these private prison corporations as well. So,
do you think there should be any enforcement agency to enforce immigration laws?
So I think there needs to be a fundamental shift. So again, getting rid of the Department of Homeland Security would be a good start. I think there needs to be a complete shift in U.S. foreign policy, something that I didn't talk about in the course of my initial remarks. But let's remember the role of U.S. government foreign policy in creating refugees, forced migration. So let's remember a lot of folks came from Honduras, for example, in the past few years, and we had the coup in 2009, the U.S. supported coup. This was during the Obama administration, right? Replacing a democratically elected president and replacing him with a dictatorship, military dictatorship, which is still in power to this day. So, when you are creating conditions of destabilization and, murder of, activists and labor rights activists and indigenous human rights activists. And so you are, the US government has created those conditions forcing people to flee. And so I think that really needs to be part of the discussion. And so anytime you're talking about immigrant stress, you also need to bring in the role of US foreign policy. And so, rather than, small reforms here and there, I think as, folks with a deep understanding of the system, we need to broaden our vision and really seek a fundamental reform so that, again, immigrants are not viewed as national security threats, rather as our neighbors, our community members, as fellow human beings whom we are, welcoming, providing refuge to, and thinking about, the role that this government has played in forcing people to flee their homes.
Great. We have a question here in the chat that is, how long has it been policy to incarcerate immigrants, and what are the stated grounds for doing that? And maybe I just add to that, what are all the kind of different reasons that women may be in Irwin, or women and men in any of the detention centers?
So I would say, a long time, the detention of immigrants, has been happening for a few decades, but it really has ballooned definitely since 9/11. One of the reasons being that the private prison corporations after 9/11, they found a great opening, right? Again, going back to the atmosphere that we had, let's just put them all in prison. And, in terms of the variety of reasons why immigrants are in detention, some folks could just be awaiting their asylum hearing, right? They're afraid to go back because of torture or other, threats of persecution. So that's why they're in detention. Some people may have been convicted of an offense, but they have already served time for that. So the purpose of them being in detention is to await their deportation proceeding. And so immigration detention is supposed to be civil, Yet these are actual prisons and the conditions are punitive, to be sure.
We have a question from Kay Johnson.
This is probably a little naive or ignorant, but what kind of model of a better way to do this, and what countries are doing that?
Well, I mean, in terms of a model, I mean, what I can think of is when I was a law student, I was for the, alternative spring break, we would go to this house. I went to the University of Michigan. So there was this house in Detroit called Freedom House. And so, families who are awaiting their asylum hearings were placed together in this house. And so we as, students, university students would go visit, we would cook together, we would play games together, and there was a lawyer on site providing representation to people for their asylum hearing. So that's, one model probably to follow in the short term. In terms of other countries, I'm not really promoting the system in any country. At this moment in time, unfortunately, as I'm sure you all know, seen the rise of fascism in different parts of Europe, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and white supremacy is, on the rise for sure. And so I have not seen a good model that I want to promote, but I think as human rights organizers and activists, we shouldn't kind of limit ourselves to what, the various governments are doing, rather come up with this new vision. There's a book by the author Harsha Walia, and I'll put the name in the chat, called Border and Rule. And she also has written previous books that I would highly recommend folks take a look at. She's a Canadian author. Just, looking at this whole system of obviously, borders as mechanisms to kind of exclude, brown and black people, and how and why were borders drawn, and just the roots of, the US immigration system, which is based in white supremacy. And so, the vision of obviously, during the summer, we heard a lot from folks in terms of, abolishing police and abolishing prisons. I think, we need to go beyond that to, obviously also abolishing ICE and these other types of, state mechanisms to really punish and dehumanize immigrants. And I think the dehumanization part is a big part of it, right? I mean, why else would you have this prison in South Georgia with women there where ICE knew, again, as far back as 2018, that these women were being subjected to forced sterilization and other forms of medical abuse, and they didn't do anything. I started visiting Irving actually soon after they started detaining immigrants. So back in 2010. So, I've been going there all these years. And one of the problems that women always complained about was the lack of clean underwear, which led to a whole host of, rashes and infections. And, I brought up the question to the warden during a tour, like, this is a serious problem. Like, why wouldn't you all just provide fresh underwear? And I know for a fact that there were organizations actually who were willing to take bags of fresh underwear to the women. And it just did not register as a concern at all for the warden. The only way that this could happen is if you have, engaged in a process of dehumanization of the immigrant population at Irving. So it does not matter how they feel or what is happening to their bodies or what is happening to their psyches. So again, I think we need to go, beyond sort of the reforms and really talk about, the roots of the problem and how we could dismantle that and come up with a new vision.
Azadeh, if you permit me on this, just one characteristic of the U.S. system that I think is quite in line with the root causes that you're saying, but essentially, especially speaking for people seeking asylum here, you enter and automatically you're thrust into an adversarial system and going into removal proceedings in which you're in court proceedings to expel you, and then you have to make your case defensively against that process, even though there is no crime in seeking asylum or protection. Whereas, and this is contrast in many countries, including Europe, where you may have to prove a case in order to remain for a certain amount of time, but you're not thrust into a system that's, well, incarcerating you, which it certainly doesn't need to do, but even, putting you in court proceedings, and by the way, without any public defenders. There is in immigration court, there are no defenders. So that's just the nature of our system that makes it what it is. So do we have another question? Beck.
Yeah, so one of my questions, thinking about the global causes and roots of why immigration happens and why people may need to not really have a choice as far as being able to stay where they are in their home countries. And then thinking about how US foreign policy has really contributed to that in so many different ways. And so I'm wondering, like, if there is, or what a foreign policy could look like that is really supporting people to be able to choose to stay in their home country if that is where they want to be.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that question. A first step would be to stop fomenting coups in other countries. And so I'm Iranian, actually, and so I was born in Iran shortly after the revolution in 1979. And so, even though I did not directly experience it, I definitely know about the 1953 coup that the US and the UK engineered against the first democratically elected prime minister of Iran, Mossadegh. Why? Because he wanted to nationalize Iranian oil. Right? And so, I mean, that fundamentally changed the course of Iranian history. And you could argue that Iran did not see true democracy after that. And so, and I mean, the same question, I think, lingers in the mind of a lot of us, like, what if that coup had not happened? And I mean, obviously, that's a story, I'm sure you all know, happened in different parts of the world and continues to happen. I mean, just look at the past couple decades. US invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, just, we started 2020 with the US government very close to attacking Iran. Let's start another war. Let's create some more forced migration. And so I think that would be the very first step. Why do we need such huge military budget? What is the purpose of that? I mean, it's not defense for sure, it's war making. So again, the connection between forced migration and US foreign policy is, let's put the focus to, a foreign policy based in dignity rather than exploitation, rather than, trying to, deprive people from their natural resources or, domination in some sort. And even when there's no war, there's sanctions. So you have, US government sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, et cetera, because of, the US government, lack of agreement with the policies of those particular governments. And of course, sanctions are deadly and another form of aggression. So I'm going to put in the chat a couple resources for you all pertaining to the issue of forced migration, and also, US foreign policy that, could be based in dignity, not domination.
I think Jane had a question. Oh, you're muted. Still muted.
I was not aware that immigration courts did not have defenders as a part of the system. So are we asking people who may not even speak English to defend themselves? Oh my.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Thank you.
It is. And, another issue to keep in mind is, just the location of these detention centers. I mean, I always think that it is intentional on the part of ICE to go to the most remote place you can think of, and, and have these detention centers, because obviously, Irvin, Stewart, again, very remote, very difficult for communities of support, advocates, attorneys to get out there. And so that, continues the cycle of isolation for immigrants. And the more kind of isolated you feel, that has a real impact on your psyche. And so some immigrants, even though they might have a very good case for asylum, they might just be signing the rights away just because they can't take it anymore. Under the really poor conditions of detention that we've been talking about, and just the lack of support, despite despite what a lot of organizers and activists try to do in terms of providing support, but it is difficult. And so that's that's another facet to keep in mind.
Thank you.
I'll let, if someone else has a question, I'll let them go first, but I do have another question. Anyone else?
I don't see any other hands raised, Beck, so I think that unless Ellen has a message in the chat, I think you're good to go.
All right. And so I guess my next question is, as I understand it, there is a few different legislations that have been proposed in Congress. And so I'm wondering, related to immigration. And so I'm wondering if any of those, if you have a favorite, or if any of those feel like it's getting towards what we need.
We haven't seen anything that we like. I haven't seen any piece of legislation calling for abolishing of ICE or abolishing of immigration detention. So that's, that's the real problem. A lot of legislation that has been proposed, unfortunately, still includes, some compromises, throwing people with, with involvement with the criminal legal system under the bus. And that's all, that's all a problem. And so, we really do need to see some, some revolutionary piece of legislation coming out of this Congress. So I think, continuing to push for defunding of ICE, and ensuring that, all immigrants are treated with the dignity that they deserve, regardless of their involvement with the criminal legal system, is really important. And I don't know, Ellen or anyone else, if, if you all had any thoughts on that, feel free to share on behalf of your organizations.
Ellen, if you're talking, at least I can't hear you, even though you are unmuted.
How's that?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. We have seen policy intentions from the Biden administration that suggest they do indeed plan to eliminate private detention, private corporations, for-profit corporations, earning profit from those facilities. That my last read of that was that it was, at the end of the current contracts, which I'm sure there are many ways that can be softened and so forth, but it's certainly not the end of detention. However, there is also some seeing signals of lowering detention of asylum seekers, and specifically now after undergoing very severe conditions, those that were expelled under the Remain in Mexico MPP policy, that are being starting to come into the U.S., being allowed in without detention, going straight on to their destination. So there's some things, but we're a long way from what you're saying, Azadeh. So I certainly just would say here too there is no law that says that we have to detain immigrants on immigration grounds. There's a lot of discretion in this, and so absolutely, just by discretionary means, we could have everybody be on essentially on their own recognizance, and there's no reason to detain strictly on immigration grounds. So there's every basis for abolition, as you're saying, Azadeh. So I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the Biden administration did take a positive step in terms of directing the Department of Justice to stop the use of private prisons. I mean, that's great, but that's what we also need to see in terms of ICE, right? Because we haven't seen that yet. And so there's no reason why the Department of Justice should be required not to deal with private prisons, and ICE can go ahead and deal with private prisons, right? And so that's really where the push needs to be, for them to expand that same directive to ICE as well, so that that nobody would have to deal with private prisons at all anymore.
Okay, I see a question from Nancy Bartlett.
Hi, this is just a very kind of a basic, how does it work question, but does everyone in detention, do they have a place to go if they're released? Do they have relatives? Do they have sponsors? Do I understand that there have been obstacles placed in the way of organizations and faith communities maybe being sponsors? And I've also been thinking that in terms of the children at the border, we don't want them to be in detention centers. Do they all have family to go with? Or what happens to children who don't have a place to go? Are they put in foster care? So it's kind of just a how does it work question.
Yeah, I can start, and Ellen, feel free to chime in, because I think you work a lot on these particular issues. So I mean, some do definitely. Some folks in detention would have family members to go to, would have sponsors, and same with children. I think the issue is thinking of true alternatives to detention that are not part of the carceral system. That is not, putting people on ankle bracelets that are, by the way, like those, the ankle bracelets, a lot of times are also operated by private prison corporations. And there's talk of them, some of them are already very invested in that process, which is part of the carceral process. But there's talk of them thinking ahead of, well, if at some point there's enough pressure on ICE, and they stop dealing with us, then maybe we can invest in that whole, the ankle bracelet business. So rather than, thinking of that, how can we come up with actual true alternatives to detention that, treat people humanely in a family setting or otherwise. And then I don't know, Ellen, if you wanted to chime in on this.
Yeah, there, adults or children who are with their parents don't need a sponsor to be free from incarceration, and much less so in the case of COVID in the middle of a pandemic. Whether or not they are able to establish, their basic needs outside of detention is, each would be case by case, and some would, be much more in need of some sort of community support than others who might have it by their family means and their own, personal community means. But it's going to beat being, not being free and being held in really terrible conditions like we've heard from Azadeh. When it comes to unaccompanied children, though, who enter the U.S., there are very special considerations there, because essentially they're in our country seeking protection, but they are alone. So there is a unique and distinct system in which they go into the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services Office for Refugee Resettlement, who operate shelters that are state licensed facilities that have to have, you know, certain standards, which are they are a form of detention. I have to be honest. They're in custody, but they're not free to go until an appropriate sponsor has been found, so that essentially they go from a government custody into an individual who's been vetted, who's usually a family member. So it's like foster system in that sense, but they aren't free to go until that happens, because there's a kind of duty. Now, currently, with the increasing number of minors who are ending unaccompanied, many, way too many, are not finding places in these appropriate facilities, and they are being detained. But other than that, everybody, there's no reason they couldn't be free to go. And mostly it's fair to say what we know about alternatives to detention that are community-based and case management-based for asylum seekers and others who are just in the immigration system and not in, you know, criminal proceedings. They work very well, that people are compliant with their court dates because they're interested in having it, and don't need to be detained to show up for court, you know, and generally are doing no harm. So I don't see if there's another question. I did want to ask one question.
Jane does have a hand up. Sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You're muted.
Okay, there we go. Oh, wait, I forgot my question. Oh, I had read that even if some of these children had family members or sponsors, if they were not citizens, they could get picked up by ICE when they came to try and get the children. Is that correct?
So you're saying the sponsors are family members who come if they are undocumented? Then
yes, exactly. So that would keep you from coming if you were undocumented, even if you could help this child.
So I believe that policy was recently changed by the Biden administration per a memo that they issued. Is that your understanding, Ellen?
I believe so, but I'm also not always confident of how well those memos go through the ICE bureaucracy. And honestly, you know, they're not always just following guidance. And so, but certainly the case that we saw some really extreme examples of this, including also in other using court hearings of other, like, you know, even like child support hearings and other domestic violence case and others to incarcerate, use immigration detention to take people off to be deported, and when they were showing up for that, and also for other types of hearings. And it's certainly true that that a large number of the sponsors of the unaccompanied children are undocumented and therefore subject to this, you know, being just plucked off the streets. And and I just had one question, Azadeh, because you said that all of the women in Irwin who had been abused are now released, but I had understood that a number of them had been targeted for accelerated deportation, and some were, I know you also were concerned about those who are far away without this, but weren't some of those even post the investigation deported and before they were released?
Right. So 6 of the survivors were deported before, you know, members of Congress and lawyers could step in to stop the deportations. But then, you know, once then, you know, the lawyers have started filing individual lawsuits on behalf of their individual clients to put a stop to the deportations. And then we filed a class action lawsuit in December on behalf of, you know, the class of women who were subjected to medical abuse. And so we're able to put a stop to the deportations for now. You know, obviously the lawsuit is still pending. And so yeah, that's, you know, that's where it is. Yeah, unfortunately, some women have been deported. And so, you know, part of the larger ask also for us, for the movement, is to bring those women back so that they could take part in the investigation, they could testify against, you know, Irvin and the Private Prison Corporation and ICE. And so that also, could be a pressure point on the Biden administration as well as Congress.
We're getting close to the end here, but if we have another question or so.
Hildegarde.
Yeah, so Ellen, you mentioned earlier that a lot of the people now coming across the Mexican border were not being detained. So is this arbitrary, or does it depend on what country you come from, or what's the rule?
I don't know if you're asking me, but there is, so what I can say, and I'm sure Asa can add to this, there is still Title 42 is a ostensible public health measure that was put in place by the CDC, but under some duress by the Trump administration, to allow for this, for expelling of people who were entering, including seeking asylum, among others. That is still in place and is still being used. And there were remarks this weekend from Secretary Mayorkas that they're not applying the Title 42 expulsion, which of course is a very severe measure and not at all American, in my opinion, or whatever. It's not upholding our values, and it's still being used. But unaccompanied minors are being let through and not being expelled, and therefore also because they're not expelling children, they seem to be allowing certain families with children to get through, and we're certainly seeing some of those entering, but which ones get through and which ones do not is mysterious to many, and I don't think there's even very clear coordinate, or again, each Customs and Border Patrol sector kind of interprets it at will, and so Azadeh, you probably could say more to that.
No, I mean, I don't have very much to add. I mean, for one thing, there's definitely great need for oversight because, as Ellen mentioned too, I mean, a lot of these memos, it's really a lot of times up to the discretion. It shouldn't be, but that's how it is on the ground of the, particular ICE officer. And, we know for a fact that there's a lot of, there is elements of fascism within ICE. I mean, that's for sure. And it's been, it's been a real problem. And so I put some resources in the chat related to the connection between US foreign policy and forced migration. And so, definitely look forward to, as well as, the history of institutional violence at the US border. So look forward to staying in touch with all of you all. And for folks interested on that aspect of it, I'm sure you all know about the School of America's Watch. They continue to do really, really great work. And so we do hope that, we can get them back in Georgia for their future convenings. Please do stay in touch. It's been a pleasure talking to you all, and thank you so much for your interest in this work and for your support. It's really good to know that there are, folks out there, congregations, people of faith, and organizers and activists who are deeply caring about the plight of immigrants. And so, I wanted to thank you all for that.
Thank you. Thank you for your work.
Thank you for being with us here this evening, and we'll continue to also watch the great work of Project South and in this area and racial justice and working for the rights of kind of all of the oppressed here in our region where it's especially bad. So with that, thanking you again for being here. Hand it over to Carrie.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. So that wraps up this evening's session. I did want to mention the UUCA Justice Power Hour. I believe Dot Matthews will be presenting the next, and It is on Thursdays. You can join UUCA for an hour of community education and action on Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. I put the link in the chat as well. I hit enter a little prematurely, so it's right at the top. Each week in the Justice Power Hour, they focus on different facet of the intersectional fight for justice by spending 1 hour together in community on Zoom and then taking virtual actions together. The weekly program you can think of as a sampler platter. You'll get a brief introduction to an issue and then are provided with a wealth of follow-up information to go deeper after the conclusion of our time together. Examples of things we might do are signing petitions, sending emails, making phone calls, creating social media posts, possibly writing postcards. You're not required to do all the things, and you get to pick and choose what works for your comfort level. You'll continue to have access to the evening's agenda so that you can always go back to it and do any additional action. Next week, Adult RE is taking a little spring break. We will resume the first week of April on Tuesday at 7:30 with our first Tuesday monthly AirMac presentation, which Beck will be helping to.
Yeah, we'll be talking about policing in Buckhaven. Buckhead.
Okay.
Policing in Buckhead is what we'll be talking about.
And we'll have more specific details for that for you in next week's weekly update, or this week's weekly update that you get on Fridays.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.